right, good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I am the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're so glad to be here with all of you tonight to celebrate the brand new book, Black Power, Inc., Corporate America and the Rise of Multinational Empowerment Politics. We're here with the author, Jessica Ann Levy, in conversation with Andra Gillespie. And we're really excited to be talking about this book. It's so important for the context and history of Atlanta and for our whole country at this moment. So I'm first going to introduce Andra Gillespie. She is the Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference at Emory University. She earned her PhD in political science from Yale University. Her research focuses on the political leadership of African American politicians who attempt to transcend race and how Black voters respond to them. She is the author of The New Black Politician, Cory Booker, Newark, and Post-Racial America, and Race and the Obama Administration, Symbols, Substance, and Hope. She's also the editor of Who's Black Politics? Cases in Post-Racial Black Leadership. So welcome, Dr. Gillespie. Thank you for being here. And we're joined by the author, Jessica Ann Levy, who is an assistant professor of history at Purchase College, SUNY, where she teaches courses on U.S. history, including the history of capitalism, race and racism, and American power. Levy is the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards, including from the Library of Congress, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Jefferson Scholars Foundation. Her writing has appeared in scholarly and popular venues, and she is the author of Selling Atlanta, Black Mayoral Politics from Protest to Entrepreneurism, as well as an essay on the history of Atlanta, which appeared in Oxford Research Encyclopedia of American History. Levy is a former Atlanta resident and Emory University alum. We love to see that. And she currently resides in New York City. But congratulations to her because she will be joining the faculty of Lehigh University in the fall. So congratulations on the new job. So welcome, Dr. Levy, and welcome to everybody who is here with us tonight and everybody who is online with us tonight. We really appreciate y'all. You who are watching online, you have the opportunity to put your questions in the chat at any time, and we will vocalize them into the room. And for everybody who's physically here, if you would like to ask a question, we will bring a mic to you when the time is right. But without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Gillespie, and we will get this party started.
It has been an honor to read this book. So I want to start, and is it okay if I call you?
Please.
All right, thank you. So while the main title of your book is Black Power, Inc., the subtitle, I think, is more important because it includes the word empowerment, which is the overarching theme of your book. So for those who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, can you tell us how you define empowerment?
Yeah. Well, thank you. And thank you for that kind introduction. I just want to start by saying it's a real honor to be here at Charis, a place that I think in my early, adulthood probably inspired parts of what started me on the journey that led me to this book, which is titled Black Power, Inc., but is really a history of what I call Black empowerment politics. And the term Black empowerment today has many different meanings. I think as the term has become used more, right, its meaning has become more diffuse and means various different things. But I use it in a way that still has a lot of resonance for the ways that people use Black empowerment to mean Black economic empowerment. And specifically, I'm talking about an ideological and a political movement that really promoted entrepreneurship, corporate community partnerships, and other kinds of market for-profit ventures as key to Black people's liberation. And I draw this definition from some of my actors who, some of whom use the term Black empowerment, but were engaged in this kind of political movement even before the term's existence, which actually part of this book traces the intellectual history of Black empowerment back to the 1960s and thinks about its the ways it comes out of and diverges from the more popular phrase Black Power.
So Black empowerment, as you've mentioned, has a long history, and you trace the term back to the 1960s, but the origins of the idea of Black empowerment, you argue, go all the way back to Booker T. Washington. So can you explain his role in helping to shape the idea of Black empowerment?
Yes. So, Black empowerment as a politics has various roots, multiple roots, but most notably, I think a kind of Booker T. Washington racial uplift. The first chapter of the book is actually called Booker T's Ghosts, and it looks at the ways that Washington and Washingtonian racial uplift also, being a political and ideological movement that has many varieties, many flavors. But this emphasis on industrial education, but also a kind of Christian morality, build her up from the bootstraps, inspires many of the people and actors and institutions that go on to play an important role in the development of Black empowerment politics, including two of the book's central figures, who are Leon Sullivan and Samuel Matsuyama. And Matsuyama in particular, I think, also highlights why Booker T. Washington is such a central figure here, because Washington, in promoting racial uplift, wasn't just speaking to an American audience, but also was hugely influential across the African diaspora. And so the book, really talks about Black empowerment as a diasporic politics, one that touches down in various parts of the continent, most notably in South Africa. And in doing so, it builds on a legacy that was already established by Booker T. Washington, half a century earlier.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but I interpreted your basic argument is that Black empowerment was deployed in a way to triangulate or supplant more radical notions of Black power. So it's incorporating some elements of Black power, mostly the nomenclature, but it's doing something else that's very, very different in terms of its invocation of capitalism. Can you expand on that?
Yeah. So there is, a way in which I think, Black empowerment politics and Black power, I argue, come out of the same space. And that space really is the post-World War II Black metropolis. They come out of, a moment in time when various Black leaders and others were trying to reckon with the problems of deindustrialization, underemployment, obviously segregation. And, there are moments where I think they have important intersections. And some of the people I call proponents of Black empowerment, including Sullivan, used the discourse of Black power. But when they used it in a very different way than I think many of us are familiar, specifically to talk about economic, but again, for-profit, often corporate forms. And I really kind of take this idea of the corporation and incorporating the Black struggle quite literally to look at the ways that Black empowerment organizations modeled themselves or became business and used businesses to try to further the Black struggle. And so that's where I think really we see the divergence between Black empowerment and Black power, where many Black power activists pursued more communal, in some cases explicitly anti-capitalist politics. Black empowerment really embraces capitalism as a vehicle for liberation and is pushing for the expansion of capitalism to include Black people, including within, Black businesses, but also sort of within corporate spaces, using private enterprise to empower Black people.
And just as an aside, is the embrace of capitalism a way to distinguish some Black activists from other Black activists who might be perceived as more threatening because of their critiques of capitalism?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. And especially, I think, I trace Black empowerment's evolution both as a grassroots movement that emerges within Black communities, but then sort of gets taken up and in some cases appropriated by both Democratic and Republican political administrations, by corporations, and especially as it sort of moves its way up, when I argue the ladder of sort of American power and diverges increasingly from Black power. Black empowerment is is explicitly pitted against Black power. And so I like to make the case that, where Black power, right, the kind of ideal, if we want to think about the figure, that we associate with Black power is the Black militant. We can envision the Black Panthers in their red berets and their leather jackets, modeling themselves off of revolutionaries. Black empowerment sought to replace the Black militant with the Black entrepreneur and later the Black executive. That this is what we're striving to be, as opposed to, and this is less threatening, right, to both governments, but also right to capital itself.
So I'm glad that you mentioned the partisans, because I'm a political scientist. And when I was thinking about Black empowerment, this is coming, this idea is being developed at the same time that Richard Nixon is actually trying to recruit Black voters, particularly in 1972, using appeals to Black capitalism. So how is Black empowerment perhaps different than his conceptualization of Black capitalism?
Yeah. So I think, it depends who you ask. Nixon, I think, would have tried to claim Black empowerment and does try to claim figures like Leon Sullivan. Sullivan, one of his many Black empowerment ventures is to help found one of the first Black-owned shopping centers in Philadelphia called Progress Plaza. Again, this idea of marrying, racial progress and business. And Nixon comes to visit while he's campaigning to kind of tout, right, this is what I mean by Black capitalism. But Sullivan makes a distinction, as does many other sort of proponents of Black empowerment, to say, where kind of Nixon envisioned, I think, very much a kind of separate Black economy promoting, Black businesses, small, businesses. Sullivan and other proponents of Black empowerment make the case that there is no such thing as Black capitalism. There is one capitalist system, and what we're striving for is opportunities for Black people within that system. That can be Black businesses, but that can also be Black executives, Black managers. That can be, Black people being employed in corporate America. And so really this kind of notion that really kind of, I think, came from understanding the limitations of Black capitalism, that, working with a smaller sort of, what many others have kind of talked about, the ways that, Black capital is always, there's not as much Black capital as there is, white capital. And so you're always operating with a smaller sort of capital base, and really saw that and wanted to claim the levers of real capital power, corporate, power in America.
So I'd like to think about, you've mentioned internationalism and how Booker T. Washington's reach went beyond U.S. shores. Black empowerment also was thinking about and in conversation with Pan-Africanism in some way, shape, or form, because people were looking for opportunities to expand business opportunities for American-born Blacks on the African continent, and then also to provide opportunities for Africans to be empowered and to develop capital. But this comes to a head in the 1970s, particularly in South Africa, because of the apartheid system and the robust discussions around what role could economics actually play in helping to dismantle the apartheid system. So you've mentioned Leon Sullivan. Some people may know who he is if they remember the Sullivan principles from that particular era. That actually puts activism in tension with Black empowerment. So how does that all work itself out?
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing in the international dimension. Yeah, and I mean, just to back up a second, I think one thing that's important to kind of keep in mind here, right, with this, why Black empowerment becomes international in the first place, right, is as sort of the civil rights Black power movements evolve, sort of, there's a turning towards internationalism that that happens, right, turning towards anti-colonial movements, and the anti-apartheid movement really does become one of the kind of next major movements to really animate Black activists, including Black activists on the left, who embrace the idea of divestment as the key, strategy tool to help bring down apartheid in South Africa. And I should note, notably, Sullivan, for one, and many, African-American activists originally actually embraced divestment, sort of just echoing, what they hear other anti-apartheid activists say. But at the time, Sullivan, as part of his own empowerment, has became the first Black director of General Motors, which is at the time the world's largest largest corporation. And divestment is right, strategically targeting those corporations. And so this puts Sullivan and other Black empowerment proponents in a kind of bind. How do you both act as a figure for corporations while also trying to end apartheid? And in many ways, right, Black empowerment politics provides the vehicle to do that, right? Because Black empowerment argues that the way that we're going to, it basically marries the idea of free market politics, free enterprise, and Black freedom. That those two things become conjoined, and it looks at apartheid and says, the problem really with apartheid is that it's not a free market economy. Apartheid is a form of regulation, and we're familiar with this, right? We've done this in the United States. Jim Crow was very similarly. Jim Crow denied opportunities for Black people to have equal opportunities in businesses and jobs. It denied opportunities for Black, business people to, move up the corporate ladder. And so what can help end apartheid is by actually having these same U.S. corporations apply basically the same policies and practices that they've already adopted in the United States, which is things like voluntary affirmative action, equal opportunity, taking down the whites only signs, right? Take those policies and practices and apply them in South Africa. And that, for those that are not familiar, is basically what the Sullivan Principles, which is this kind of corporate code of conduct that Sullivan helps to initiate and ends up being signed by over 120 corporations, adopt in response to the divestment movement. So rather than divest, they make the case that they can end apartheid by empowering Black South Africans, including Black African business people in South Africa, economically.
But turned out that didn't work, right? And so the divestment activists push back and sort of look at results and say, this hasn't worked. So Sullivan has to pivot a little bit. Can you describe how he does that and how he tries to respond, and sort of, I guess, take victory from the jaws of defeat?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'm trying to do in this book, and in terms of, treating people like Sullivan and these other proponents of Black empowerment, which include people like Atlanta's Andrew Young and Carl Ware, who's a vice president of Coca-Cola, is to kind of portray them as complex figures. That this isn't just about a kind of individual self-gain story. That these were activists within the corporation, and I think Sullivan's kind of navigating around the question of divestment in South Africa really illustrates this. Right? He attempts to, in his words, kind of tighten the screws on corporate America when the Sullivan Principles are not being implemented quickly or as effectively. And he kind of uses divestment as a threat. So even though he's supporting the Sullivan Principles and Black empowerment, he says if this isn't working fast enough, as apartheid isn't coming to an end, I'm going to just call quits on the Sullivan Principles, which he ends up actually doing in 1985. He leaves his own program. But interestingly, that moment, the corporations who have kind of appropriated this politics end up doubling down. And other proponents, including Carl Ware at Coca-Cola, kind of double down on Black empowerment. And so you see this interesting moment where we have divestment. Many cities, many institutions, universities, adopt divestment and sanctions policies, and corporations do divest. I might sort of put an asterisk there, but they also double down on this idea of Black empowerment and continue kind of promoting the idea that they can help not just end apartheid, but help build up. They look forward to a post-apartheid South Africa by promoting, again, kind of partnerships with Black business, by promoting kind of corporate social responsibility. So in essence, they kind of, they have their cake and eat it too. They divest, sort of they're forced to divest in a sense, but they also don't let go of the idea that Black empowerment could work.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that's actually really interesting is that the Sullivan Principles do get incorporated into the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986. They get incorporated in a way that's almost like a loophole around divestment, so that if you follow Sullivan Principles, you don't have to completely divest, and they're these shell companies, and it's actually really, really complex. You use Coca-Cola and actually Emory as examples of how corporations could have their cake and eat it too. So you've alluded to it a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit more about how people kind of found the hacks to get around actually following the letter of the law, or maybe even the letter of the principle?
Yeah. This was, I think, one of the most fascinating parts for me in terms of researching for this book, partially because I got to do some research on my alma mater, Emory, and to really take, what had been a pretty straightforward story to me, understanding anti-apartheid movement, anti-apartheid struggle for over decades to kind of, to get people to buy into divestment. This movement, which has been going on all the way from the early 60s, kind of reaches a head in the early to mid 80s, and sees its, peak with the passage of the 1986 Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, which, the divestment wins, right? And then apartheid falls. But the story is not, as I found, that simple. And what I learned is not only at a national level, to the Sullivan Principles and this idea that there's this kind of loophole to divestment where corporations can remain if they follow certain kind of code of conduct, which is basically a word for, very close to word for word adaptation of the Sullivan Principles, don't have to sort of divest, actually gets written into the divestment policies of many institutions, including Emory, whereby, and right, this is a story about corporate power and corporate influence over institutions. And I really show how corporations who had been pushed by people like Sullivan, right? So you have these civil rights and Black empowerment activists pushing corporations to kind of take a stand on apartheid. Originally, corporations wanted nothing to do with apartheid South Africa. That's political. We don't do that. We're businesses. But they're pushed to take a stand on apartheid, and they try to claim the moral high ground by saying, we can actually end apartheid by empowering Black South Africans, we'll be more effective in remaining in the country. They also, argue that if they leave, the people who are going to be hurt most by corporate, departure are going to be Black South Africans, which to some extent is true. But they then take that argument to the various institutions in which they are invested, including in Emory's case, Coca-Cola is a very sizable investor, and corporate executives are present at the meetings of administrators and committees on Emory's campus debating what to do about divestment. And they make the case, and they are successful, that there's going to be basically a partial divestment, that we're going to divest from the worst of the worst, those companies that refuse to sign the principles, but we're going to allow, right, we're going to continue investing in those companies that abide by certain rules. And just, I think there's several parts of it that are worth paying attention to. One, for those that are not really familiar, South Africa was under apartheid, because of apartheid, the most profitable place to invest in the world at the time. And so if you really wanted divestment, you were going to basically collapse the finance, the finance officers who are being asked for the first time ever to actually take a look at their investments and say, like, where are we even invested? Or like, you're going to kill our portfolio here if you really divest. So this is a way for universities in their language and other institutions to kind of claim financial responsibility. And they use that language so that while also claiming the moral high ground, right? So they also get to claim that they've divested because they've divested from the worst of the worst in redefining what divestment means. They narrow the definition of divestment to a point where it doesn't include support for Black empowerment and corporate kind of social responsibility.
Interesting. So eventually apartheid does end in South Africa, and Nelson Mandela becomes the first democratically elected president. In your book, you describe Nelson Mandela's transformation from being communist adjacent to being a strong proponent of Black empowerment. Tell us more about this.
Yeah. So without giving too much away, I guess from the book, you should go buy it. But there's a moment that struck me when I first came across it, where shortly after Nelson Mandela is released from prison. This is somewhat rumored, hard to confirm, but many suggest that the first American he met with was Carl Ware, who at the time was the first and highest ranking Black executive at Coca-Cola. And Ware has sort of made his way into the kind of anti-apartheid circles through connections with Desmond Tutu. And I use this moment to kind of say, like, what? Like this, this was actually like kind of, one of the moments that got me interested in this book. How do we get somebody who was rumored, to have been a member of the Communist Party? Some people say that rumor is true. He was, but was closely associated both with Black militancy, revolution, and with communism, to embrace, the vice president of Coca-Cola. And I go on to argue that there was a broader relationship with Coca-Cola and other U.S. corporations. So there are a few different things going on that, both have to do with Mandela himself, but also more broadly with the ANC. And this is, something I trace throughout the book, right? How do these various movements become incorporated, kind of come to embrace capital and multinational capital, right? Corporate capital. One that has to do with debates within the ANC that are going on. I think, a lot of historians of the anti-apartheid struggle, one which is an armed struggle, one which is a militant struggle, funded by, in part the Soviet Union, pay attention, to the kind of left-leaning parts of the ANC, which Mandela embraced early on, especially before he went to prison. But there also were strands within the ANC that looked around at the African continent, looked around at the socialist world more broadly in the late 1980s, saw African socialism failing in Tanzania, saw the Soviet Union collapsing, and basically, we're like, this is not actually how, we don't want just political liberation, we want economic liberation, we want economic development, and maybe there's an opportunity here with the U.S. And I think, Black empowerment, again, especially kind of being touted, being brought to Black South Africans by African Americans, by Black vice presidents, Carl Ware, Leon Sullivan, Andrew Young are the embodiment that capitalism can create successful Black managers, right? Here we have, executives of some of the largest, most well-known corporations on the planet. I remember reading something somewhere that, the two most popular, Mandela's name was basically as Coca-Cola's like brand and Mandela's brand are basically like as well known as each other, right? What does it mean to bring these two together? And so having this message that, a Black executive coming to Mandela and saying, look, I know the United States has this history. I know corporations have a history of exploitation, have a history of racism, but we have been able, through pressuring them, have pressured them to employ Black managers, have pressured them to, adopt affirmative action policies, to donate to Black banks, to support Black businesses. All of this is kind of under the broader umbrella of Black empowerment. And they can do that here too. And they can help make the end of apartheid, a post-apartheid South Africa, meaningful, and help empower Black South Africans if we work together.
So in addition to Nelson Mandela, one of the things that was actually interesting, I think because of the time in which I was reading it, was your discussion of Jesse Jackson. So, I'm reading this as we're getting news of his passing. He's also somebody who transforms into a Black empowerment disciple and an apostle as well. Could I consider him a parallel figure to Mandela, or is he a little bit different, or is he parallel to Leon Sullivan?
I think the better comparison is Sullivan. I think, one thing people may not know is that Operation Breadbasket actually was inspired by, or in part by, an earlier campaign led by Leon Sullivan called Selective Patronage in Philadelphia, which used boycotts to pressure local businesses to open more positions for Black people in skilled and better paying jobs. And this, of course, is building on a much longer tradition of Black boycotts, going back to Don't Buy You Can't, Where You Can't Work campaigns, right? So this is an older sort of strategy that Jackson, I think, employs. And so the two, right, are operating in parallel for quite some time. And I think, in some ways, I think Jackson and Sullivan are sort of analogous figures. And I just want to read a brief quote actually from the book talking about Jesse Jackson. This is during in 1982. He's speaking in is it Alabama or Mississippi? He was speaking to a joint session of the Alabama state legislature. He was actually the first Black man since Reconstruction to address the body. And one of the things that I think is kind of interesting in thinking about Jackson and Sullivan as analogous figures is the way that they knew how to deploy pragmatism. They knew sort of which parts of their agendas to highlight in different audiences. So Jackson is speaking to the Alabama state legislature, and he says, "We put too much focus on the schoolyard and not enough on the shipyard. It's about time we forget about black and white and started talking about employed and unemployed." Elsewhere, he echoes Sullivan in kind of distancing himself from social welfare, although obviously, in his part of his broader, campaigns, he was, supported aspects of a welfare state. He says, "We want trade, not social aid." And this was actually a really key component of Black empowerment politics, which, emerging at a time when the welfare state is being pulled back, when the government is not, seen as a friend of Black Americans. And I think we see Black empowerment and this idea of using the market, of using private enterprise emerge as almost out of necessity, right, in Black communities, including among, people like Jackson and Sullivan. Now, I think, Jackson takes a different path that most of the characters in my book specifically end up in the private sector for their careers. And I think the fact that Jackson, moves into electoral politics, is building a broader coalition, is more directly confronting the Reagan administration and austerity, as well as the Democratic Party establishment, means that he ends up embracing, I think, a more, at times, other kind of progressive policies than someone like Sullivan, who explicitly distanced himself from welfare and also from labor politics. So there are different flavors and different directions that Black empowerment takes, and I think we can see that in figures like Jackson.
Yeah. So what's the landscape of Black empowerment today? What traces of Leon Sullivan do we see 25 years after his death? And does the empowerment infrastructure that he helped create in the 1960s and 70s resemble the empowerment infrastructure that may or may not exist today?
Yeah. So some of those surrounding me here will know that it takes a very long time to write a book, especially one that emerges from a PhD dissertation. And when I started writing this project, I had a very clear idea of the ending. The epilogue was going to involve Barack Obama. It was going to involve Barack Obama giving a speech in Kenya about how the U.S. was going to renegotiate its, African policy based on the idea of promoting African entrepreneurs. And this was, Sullivan 2.0. In many ways, I think Black empowerment was very alive a few years ago. And also, we saw this, I think, particularly in the immediate aftermath of the Black Lives Matter movement, with the ways that various mayors, including Black mayors, responded to the uprisings by promoting kind of this idea that, one of the ways we're going to address social unrest, one of the ways we're going to perhaps mitigate some of the more militant aspects of Black Lives Matter, was by promoting Black entrepreneurship and Black economic empowerment in corporations. We're going to join in this. I love to give the example of Nike partnering with Colin Kaepernick. I think we're in a different moment now. I think, one way to, think about Black empowerment is an early history of DEI. And I think we're seeing corporations who were pressured into adopting Black empowerment in the first place, pulling back, and administrations and other institutions, that kind of institutional support, which is really key to Black empowerment's flourishing, how Black empowerment sort of takes off and becomes the kind of institutional dominant response to problems of persistent racial inequality, to social unrest. I think we're seeing a kind of pulling back on that. On the other hand, I think one of the things I've noticed too is that because of the moment we're in, we're also seeing a resurgence of some of the more left-leaning, progressive, and radical politics that Black empowerment, I think, was intended to kind of mitigate or sort of distract from. There's discussions of a revived Black Panther Party, but also I currently live in New York City, where we just elected a Democratic Socialist mayor. And I think, many of these things that were, perhaps more popular in the 1960s before a kind of Black empowerment politics took off, are also sort of being revived and as a critique, right, of the ways in which Black empowerment has perhaps, failed to address some of the persistent issues of inequality and racial inequality in the U.S. and elsewhere.
So I wanted to ask about some people and themes that don't get much space, if at all, in the book. Since you talked about Nelson Mandela's transformation, I was wondering why Bobby Seale didn't make it in the book, because I have visions in my head of barbecue sauce or whatever it was that he started to sell in the 90s. So is Seale not here because he was more of an individual entrepreneur and not necessarily trying to create broad-based job training programs and partnerships across multiple sectors?
Yeah, no, I mean, that might be me overlooking. I did actually look up in the index to see that Bobby Seale does make 2 appearances in the book, but they're used as contrasts to kind of a Black empowerment politics. So taking an earlier Bobby Seale, one who was very explicitly anti-capitalist, and a kind of 10-point program specifically linking racial capitalism, not expanding capitalism, right, destroying it. I think perhaps including the barbecue sauce, would have sort of fit in. Although, I think the figures, I think one of the things to say about this book is, when I was interested in addition to kind of thinking about Black activists that become business people, which there are a surprising number of examples of this, right, is the ways in which this broader kind of political movement becomes institutionalized. And so the figures that I sort of chose to follow were ones who sort of made it up into corporate America, or who got massive amounts of war on poverty funding. There's a whole story of the war on poverty helping to fund Black empowerment before we even get to Richard Nixon. And then, I do end up with Clinton's, sort of empowerment zones. But I think, there's a way in which Black empowerment becomes this kind of is a capacious category that I think one might be able to read Bobby Seale into a Black empowerment politics in a way that I hadn't fully considered.
So another thing, and I think that there's a reason for this. You mentioned labor, but you don't go into detail about labor. One of the interesting things about the original Sullivan Principles versus the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act was that the carve-outs for companies that didn't actually divest in terms of the principles they had to commit to, is they had to commit to supporting unionization in the firms that were still going to be engaged in South Africa. Can you explain why labor actually doesn't figure as prominently in your narrative as, some people might expect, given the critique of capitalism here?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think it has to do with that, the critique of capitalism. Black empowerment begins as a movement to pressure business, right? Begins actually as a story of boycotts and protesting against discrimination and segregation within businesses. But it is not anti-business. It is pro-profit. And the redistributional element of Black empowerment politics is one that is about creating equal opportunities within a capitalist system, as opposed to a kind of redistribution of profits that would force corporations, right, to, if you're going to pay your workers more, it should be because white and Black workers are earning the same amount for the job that they do, not that workers in general should be making more and that bosses should be making less. It's very much a politics that is kind of about expanding and, again, incorporating a kind of Black struggle into an mostly intact existing capitalist framework. Now, I say mostly because, transforming a capitalist system that primarily benefits white people into one that also benefits Black people does transform capitalism, right? And there are kind of success stories within there about Black businesses and Black people getting jobs, and there's a real material benefits that come out of various Black empowerment programs. But it is often contrast with labor militancy and unions. Sullivan himself is mostly implicitly, but at times explicitly anti-union. He kind of comes around on the question of South Africa because just the South African labor movement is so central to the anti-apartheid movement. He's sort of really pressured into supporting Black trade unions there. But he's uncomfortable, right, with a kind of labor politics that is really, contesting the very system of capitalism and the structure of capitalism. He would rather see sort of Black people profit through making their way up in the corporation, not transforming the corporation.
I think the discussion of labor is also important because I want to think about prescriptions. Mm-hmm. So towards the end of your book, you note the limits of empowerment politics. So in particular, these empowerment programs have not actually abated Black-white inequality in the U.S. or South Africa. So this would suggest that they didn't do what people were hoping that they would do. So what are the alternatives that would be viable? So, in particular, you mentioned remarks from the economist Thomas Piketty, who actually proposed a graduate tax as a form of redistribution, possible way to address the inequality that empowerment politics did not actually solve. So is that the only sort of remedy or are there other things that we should be considering?
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up. I think I do want to emphasize that this, there's a strong, I hope, critique of Black empowerment politics throughout the book. But I think particularly in the case of South Africa, which to this day remains the most racially unequal country on earth. And Thomas Piketty very notably pointed this out. And the failures of what the ANC adopts as Black economic empowerment as its primary post-apartheid economic policy, one which depends on kind of Black people gaining shares of private corporations and gaining access to Black businesses, but has, to many people's dismay in South Africa, not included, the widespread protections for Black labor that many who within the labor movement who were also part of the anti-apartheid struggle assumed that there would be in a post-apartheid South Africa. So I think, there are a variety of different ways that we can think of, alternatives. I do think one thing that Black empowerment politics really does is it tries to work through the private sector. And I mentioned earlier that in part is because of the failures of the state, to address racism. But I think one thing that the critics of Black empowerment politics have come around to is the importance of the state as a tool of redistribution. So I do think that the tax part and just a broader kind of public, welfare and the kind of state taking a proactive role in a kind of redistributional politics is a really important counter to Black empowerment. The other is, I think, a kind of stronger, labor movement and labor protections. And the other one I want to mention here is us, part of labor, but in terms of thinking about beyond a kind of, traditional, who we think of laborers, people who work in the informal economy and, reproductive, we're sitting here in Charis, a feminist and queer space that thinks a lot about women and women's work and, unpaid labor, because there's a part of Black empowerment politics that I argue that has a very masculinist, patriarchal, male breadwinner vision to it. Especially some of its earliest proponents were really striving, to kind of think about ways to boost, what they, to address what they saw as a crisis of Black masculinity, as a crisis of the Black family, where Black men were not able to be the breadwinners. And so a lot of Black empowerment politics in many different instances has this kind of masculinist, patriarchal tint to it. And so to kind of think more about what happens if we center Black women, both Black, women in business, but Black women, operating, doing a lot of unpaid labor and social reproduction as an alternative vision.
So that's great. So, all right. So if we're going to have this prescriptive table where we come up with something better. So there are elites who are at the table. You've mentioned the state, you've mentioned labor unions, and you have mentioned women or other people who might be doing unpaid or reproductive labor. Is there anybody else who should be at this table in order to come up with a more robust solution that might do a better job?
Yeah. I think everybody should be at the table. And that's, there's a moment, prior to Sullivan's becoming the first director of GM, a lot of this book is about a kind of theory of social change in which activists push businesses to change, and they do change, just the activists don't get to control the change. The corporations hold on to how that change happens. So the change, part of the activism that gets Sullivan to become the first Black board member, is there's a broader movement for democracy coming out of the New Left, a shareholder activism, figures like Ralph Nader, but I also bring in various people like Shirley Chisholm, who are arguing for a kind of different vision of corporate America. And they actually proposed to GM that GM should be governed not by its, corporate executives, but by representatives, right? That there should be, environmental movement representative, labor representative, women representative, that everybody who the corporation touches, so consumers, workers, investors, all should have a seat at the table that governs these very powerful institutions that affect our lives. And then that should be what corporate governance looks like. And I really was struck by that because it's a very different democratic vision of corporate America, of kind of how capitalism is run, and one that doesn't rely on the state to regulate. It's not a kind of traditional story about kind of government regulation, but it was kind of thinking about corporations and what it truly would mean to build a socially responsible capitalist system where corporations are not primarily serving the investors, but are serving everyone for whom the corporation touches in a way. And that's, I think, an interesting way to kind of think about, a table and who should be sitting around that table.
Yeah. Well, I could ask many more questions, but it's time for others to be able to ask their questions. So.
Yeah. So while we're waiting for our folks online to weigh in, does anybody in here want to ask a question? Yeah, go ahead.
You alluded to this a little bit with the speech of Barack Obama, right? That if you knew you wanted to end the book that way, is that what inspired you to write the book, or what brought about this whole concept?
Oh, thanks for that question. Atlanta inspired this book. I think this is a really important place for me to be giving this this talk. This book emerged out of my experiences as an undergrad in Atlanta, and thinking about a city, right, that is on one hand, the home of the civil rights, the home of Martin Luther King Jr., the heart of this the civil rights movement, and one in which I saw kind of as a young adult here, where Black entrepreneurship and corporations kind of appropriating that legacy and that history were all over the place, and that not vibing with at least what I had initially about the civil rights movement, that was about boycotts and about protests and, or at least what I imagined to be kind of anti-business. And so this book actually emerged out of early attempts to try to understand the trajectory of Black politics in Atlanta, a particular thread of Black politics, Black electoral politics in Atlanta. And then, following Andrew Young, who spends a significant amount of his time not in Atlanta, or did as mayor of Atlanta, spend a significant time to Africa, sort of led me to realize that what was happening in Atlanta, my earlier article was titled From Protest to Entrepreneurism, was actually happening all over the place, including transnationally, including in Africa.
I'm wondering how your research looked at 501c3s as a thread in this trend.
Yes, thank you. So there's been some really interesting scholarship. I just want to shout out a book by Claire Dunning called Nonprofit Neighborhoods that thinks a lot about the ways that nonprofits structurally end up having to work a lot like corporations in the essence, in the need to constantly raise funds and to appeal to fundraisers or bigger foundations, other 501c3s. But they factor it a little bit in this kind of one of the chapters of the book is called Incorporating Struggle, and it looks at both it puts for-profit and nonprofit organizations alongside one another and kind of tries to make the argument that while one's for-profit and one's not profit, both end up kind of the very nature, that the very legal aspect of incorporating necessitates certain kind of directionalities within the organization. So Sullivan established 1 million different organizations, but he has a nonprofit organization, Opportunities Industrialization Centers, which is a nonprofit, but has the word Inc. in it. And then he has a for-profit, Progress Ventures. And both of them start as community ventures, are sort of, kind of, they're founded with money raised from his church congregants. They're supposed to be for and kind of by the Black community in North Philadelphia, which is where sort of Sullivan is based for the large part of his career. And over time, as they become bigger, as they expand, as they gain more funding, I watched how sort of you can follow the account books of these organizations and you can follow the meeting minutes of their sort of executives. They become increasingly focused on where are we getting our next, paycheck, whether that's a donation or that's, a kind of business partnership with a various corporation, and how that, almost kind of structurally, institutionally means that they become less attuned to their community and more attuned to kind of, become more like a corporation that is, serving. Now, of course, that is not all nonprofits. And I think, but it's an interesting problem that I think a lot of nonprofits face in kind of fighting the pressure to kind of always be thinking about the money.
Thank you. I asked that because I think my generation, I'm in my 40s, of activists got streamlined into a sort of professional nonprofit track, and a lot of folks got pulled off the streets and pulled off maybe more radical movement work to get health insurance, to get, because they had a baby and they were like, hey, this job's gonna, but then, as you mentioned, early in the talk, the DEI sort of industry collapsed because corporations were not actually invested in it. Many large profits were not actually invested. Their heart was not in it, right? And so I've been watching a lot of my peers who were in these larger nonprofits just have sort of a reckoning around oh, okay, what do I do now? Because everything's been laid bare. And
yeah. And I think that tracking, I think, is kind of what, I'm thinking about in terms of thinking about how Black empowerment politics, and I think you can kind of trace a similar parallel movement, kind of, you could talk about a women empowerment, which, merges both parallel and also intersecting with Black empowerment. But yeah, this kind of the ways in which, it completely understandably, right, the state wasn't, we don't have universal health care. We have used private enterprise to solve a lot of our problems. And that has also necessitated the emergence of a nonprofit sector. But thinking about what are the alternatives, what have we lost because of that, right? We've lost the opportunity for a robust public system that, when corporations, as they do, see a more profitable path or decide, right, it no longer makes business sense to do X, Y, and Z, we are sort of, left picking up the pieces.
Thank you. Any last questions? Well, one of the ways that we like to close out is to, you mentioned one great book. Are there any books that you kind of think about your book being in conversation with?
Oh, wow. There are so many excellent books right now on thinking about the intersections of race and capitalism, which is in some sense, one of the main kind of threads of this book. So too many to name, but I'll shout out, I think, two that are coming to mind, both dear colleagues and friends whose books are out recently. Danielle Wiggins, who is an Emory alum, recently came out with a book called Black Excellence. I think we tell parallel overlapping in some senses, but also different stories, and in a very different direction, but thinking about the ways that capitalism and corporations have profited off of efforts to address racial inequality in the kind of post-civil rights movement. Bench Ansfield's Born in Flames book about race and the insurance industry in the Bronx and elsewhere are two excellent books. But there's a lot of really excellent work coming out right now around race and capitalism.
Awesome. Oh, we just got a great question. So Yolanda asked, in today's 2026 fever dream of federal deregulation and rescinded funding, is preparing and producing through corporate partnerships a viable path to resilience, or has it become a forced survival strategy that ultimately deepens our dependency on the systems we aim to transform?
Oh, yes, and both. No, I think this is the real challenge, and I think what I really do, I think we're in some ways a similar moment, or heading towards a similar moment to the ones in which some of the activists in my book sort of had their political education, right? One in which, a dear mentor and advisor once instilled in me that there is no such thing as the neoliberal turn for Black communities, because the state was always neoliberal. The state was never, a strong supporter. Black people have always, and other marginalized communities have always had to rely on their own initiative to survive and to thrive. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. While at the same time, I think one of the things this book does try to highlight is the limitations of that, right? The limitations of what happens when we give up on or abandon or stop trying to demand justice from corporations and justice from the state, and simply sort of, look for cooperation and look for and sort of, self-reliance and self-sufficiency don't always bring about that broader reckoning that I think we should continue to push for.
We have a question from Henrietta. Henrietta says, do you see any present day heirs to Louis Sullivan or even Jesse Jackson?
Oof. I mean, I know nobody kind of prominently enough is at this particular, I mean, maybe Cory Booker, but I don't know. You would be better answer to that, I think, than, I think in the way I would have a few years ago, there's no one sort of immediately coming to mind. Not to say that I think I should say that a number of the organizations that I talk about in this book actually are still operating. So Opportunities Industrialization Centers, which is one of Sullivan's perhaps largest and most enduring organizations, still exists today. Provides education and job training. You can walk around most urban areas in this country and find something that has the words empowerment center in it somewhere. There's one in a few blocks from my house that I can think of, but they're smaller. I think the kind of spotlight on Black empowerment has shifted, but definitely I think this kind of politics still exists at a kind of smaller level right now. But I think the voices that are rising to the fore right now are perhaps ones that are offering different visions.
I think that's a great place to wrap up. So thank you, Dr. Gillespie. Thank you, Dr. Levy. This is a wonderful conversation. I want to let our folks know that they can buy the book from Charis online, and we would love for you to do that. I will drop that link in the chat. And for all of our folks here, we, of course, have books available. Some of you have already gotten yours, so thank you for that. We have a great slate of events coming up, so please check out our Charis website. And this event will be up on our YouTube channel in just a few days. So if there are folks who should have been here tonight who are not, please let them know they can watch it online. So thanks, everybody. We're going to say goodnight to our online folks, and be safe and be well. Thank you.
Thank you.